This week on fxguidetv.
We're at NAB covering the new Flame 2015 release.
Hello, I'm Angie and thanks for being with us. While much of the product releases at NAB are now often things that are announced actually prior to the show, this historic trade show is still a great place to see the world's best production equipment, and it still has a few surprises.
Thanks, Angie. Well, we're here at the Flame Autodesk Users Group, literally a users group meeting here at the NAB 2014.
Yeah, it's a group of people who actually set up a Facebook page. It's kind of grown on its own, and Autodesk was nice enough to sponsor them here at NAB with drinks as well as some demos of cool stuff that's new in the software. And we're here because this episode of fxguidetv is focused on the new release of Flame 2015 from Autodesk. But obviously we're here at NAB and there's a lot more going on.
A lot going on. We kind of call this the hardware show as opposed to a lot of the more brain shows, I guess you might call them. You know, there's the classic million displays here. There's cameras. Everybody's got a new camera. For a lot of the production gear stuff, Jason Wingrove is here from the RC podcast. And he and Mike will do a recap of all that stuff. Real quick though, AJA released a camera, I'm sure you've probably heard about that. And Blackmagic added more cameras to their line. There's a lot of cameras nowadays.
Yeah, it seems like if you're going to get in that game in a good way, similar to ecosystems and things like Apple, you can see Blackmagic really successfully exploiting that. AJA is trying to take advantage of that as well, I believe.
Yeah, and they're doing cool stuff, and 4K is again the big buzzword. 4K, 4K, 4K. Everybody's showing 4K, shipping 4K, which I thought was a few years ago, but it's bigger this year. So, and then Monday night, we were there to watch the announcement for the Foundry of Nuke Studio, which was announced Monday night, very top secret live streaming event that they pulled off, and reactions have been pretty strong because it's basically taking Hero and integrating Nuke into Hero, as well as, I guess you could call them adjustment layer kind of functionality,
right.
Color corrections, time warps, LUTs, text, the kind of things you'd want to do to finish a spot.
Yeah, exactly, and you know, it's probably not a total surprise that they're coming up with this. You guys see the writing on the wall. They have a shot-based compositor, they have a timeline-based product, and merging them makes sense. And you know, we'd be remiss to mention we're right here at the Autodesk booth, and I think it's kind of aimed squarely, or at least apart, at the smoke market as well as flame market. I think you could easily say.
Yeah, definitely. And that's been the reaction I've seen online and talking to people in the hall is, ooh, I better start learning some Nuke, you know, as well. So, not that most people haven't kind of made a lot of that transition, somewhat anyway.
But that release is actually later this year, by the end of 2014. But again, we're here to talk about the new Flame release, which is actually releasing 1 week from now.
Which looks really nice.
Yeah, there's a lot of new stuff and a lot of changes, but there's some things we just wanted to point out. I wrote an article kind of covering a lot of the details I think were kind of missed in some of the general PR regarding this release. But one of them is, with this release, if you own a Flint system, Smoke Advanced on Linux, Inferno, or even Smoke HD, old school Smoke HD, when Flame 2015 releases, you're actually going to be owning Flame 2015 because you get a free cross-grade of that. Those products, Flint, Smoke Advanced, and so forth, actually will no longer exist as of the 2015 release.
Right, and then what about Smoke on the Mac?
Well, Smoke on the Mac is now, they're just going to call it Smoke, but it's actually going to move to a subscription-based model moving forward, and that's starting in May. And there are actually some pretty big changes in that, and there's kind of one group of people who probably bought Smoke on Mac 2 years ago, Smoke 2013, who paid, you know, upwards of, you know, over $3,000, and more than that, $700 on support. This is their first major release that they've gotten as part of that, and there's going to be a big transition in moving to that desktop model and losing some of the Flame compatibility. But that's something we covered in the online article. Yeah, you should really check that out because it's a little too complex to just sit here and talk about.
The bottom line is Smoke on the Mac becomes subscription and loses interoperability with Flame.
Yeah, as part of that desktop model subscription, which is about $1,700 a year.
But typical to any big company or any big release like this, check the article out because John's covered it in great detail, and there's a lot of moving parts and a lot of complexity to it. So,
well, since we're here, we want to get a couple reactions from some owners and artists who use Flame. So let's go ahead and hear from them.
I mean, honestly, my first reaction was, wow, this is great, because you know, at my shop we have a couple licenses of SMAC, but we really only use it as an assistant to Flame. You know, it wasn't really until I saw some of the user feedback on the Logic group and the other online worlds, of people who had standalone licenses of SMAC who now feel like, hey, what about me? It's a tough position to be in, but you kind of have to decide where you want to put your resources when it comes to development. Maybe I'm selfish, but I'm happy that they're going all in behind Flame, which is really great. At my shop at Spontaneous, it's going to be fantastic. We have 3 seats of Flame Premium and other seats of Flame, but now with those 3 seats of Flame Premium, I have a Flame Assist for each one, I have a Flare for each one, and it's just going to make ramping up and bringing on new artists and training younger artists just that much easier. It's just fantastic. It's kind of a game changer.
Well, as usual, when a big release comes out from Autodesk, we like to check in with Philippe Soeiro, and you got a chance to do that again this year.
Yeah, before both of us came to NAB, Philippe was in Montreal, I was in LA, and through modern internet technology, we were able to do an interview to get caught up on what's new with the 2015 release of Flame.
3D Shape is a very cool tool. It's really it is something that we found very hard to kind of summarize in a couple of lines, because there are multiple ways that you could look at it. It is as much a graphic design tool, and that far surpasses the legacy capability that we've had to import into Action Gmasks that would be done and designed into the Gmask node and then bring them into Action. So you could see it as a replacement to that, but it far supersedes its capabilities. It's capable of designing very complex shapes, animated completely in the context of Action. It uses the same spline model as the Action Gmask that we introduced a while back, and you can look at it, as again a graphics design tool which supports animation, texturing, a whole bunch of things that you would expect from, let's say, a spline-based type of shape, but it is also, that is extrudable, but it is also something that you can look at as a basic modeling tool for projection purposes, and that's definitely like a very strong use case that it has. But beyond that, what we've tried to do is create a very hybrid type of object that is as much geometry as it is a Gmask, and therefore is capable of performing blending operations, but also feathering operations from a Gmask, all inside of one single object. So we believe that it is also a tool that will hopefully actually change, and should actually change, the way that you approach certain compositing problems inside of the Action 3D space.
I also want to point out one important thing that I'm not sure you touched on, which is the SVG import, which actually is a really important, critical part of that tool. I think we've wanted vector import for a long time within Flame, and this actually delivers on that.
Yes, absolutely, and you're right. I forgot to mention it, but it is indeed a very important thing. There's a couple of limitations with SVG, but still it features like a very robust way of importing vector shapes from SVG, which we see as becoming like a ubiquitous standard, and actually preserving a lot of its characteristics. There are some exceptions, but based on the feedback that we'll be getting, we're obviously very open to actually be more inclusive about some functionality that people would want from the SVG format to preserve that.
Yeah, and it's pretty easy to work with that right in Illustrator. You can save as SVG natively, open them up, edit them again, and as you mentioned, certain properties come across, like the object color, for instance. So if you have a multicolored logo, that works really well. Yes. But one thing that goes along with this tool, I think that's really takes to the next level, so to speak, is the Replica tool. I used to do a lot of cascading expressions, things like that, but this actually does that and so much more.
Yeah, we like to look at the Replica tool more as a facilitator. It is something that very quickly allows you to create instances of objects, and we found that actually it was something that would greatly enhance the range of things that you could do even with 3D Shape. And something that I didn't necessarily mention is that 3D Shape understands a very, I guess, special and unique way of performing Boolean operations live. So punching holes into surfaces and actually adjusting them live in kind of real time as you're adjusting the splines. And Replica is something that can allow you to very quickly, change the way that you would even approach a basic modeling problem with 3D Shape by, instancing holes that you would have in a shape, and you would be surprised actually how easy it makes it to create repeatable patterns, things like that. But of course, it's not limited to that. It can also replicate pretty much anything that you can have inside of an action schematic, and that includes image surfaces, particle generators, pretty much everything, actually.
And you can replicate replica nodes, in fact.
Yes, and that's it's very important to note that yes, indeed, Replica knows how to replicate also a branch that actually has other replica nodes inside of it, creating a pretty intricate cascading effect. The tool is intentionally simple, if not simplistic. And again, this is why I think we don't necessarily look at it per se on its own as a creative tool, but it's a great facilitator to do things inside of the action space. And 3D Shape actually can put it to use in a very remarkable way.
Yeah, it certainly can. Well, I want to touch on some more than advancements, but you might be surprised. I pinged a couple people who've been beta testing the software, and I expected them to maybe say 3D Shape or Replica was their favorite thing, but actually almost to a person, one of the biggest advancements that people saw in the software were some of the optimizations you've done in the render pipeline, and specifically single frame optimizations. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because it sounds simple, but it actually really makes a big impact in people's workflow.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and I guess this is part of again a multi-tier re-architecturing of the software that is ongoing. It's I don't think we'll ever be able to say that it's totally finished, but this is a very important milestone. It affects the way that you can work in the timeline or in batch, since they both use the same processing pipeline. And essentially, we've implemented a mechanism that kind of understands if you have a still frame or anything that we can generate, such as text, for example, without any animation, the software and the pipeline become smart enough to understand that it only needs to render it once and then kind of just perform the blending of that object in real time over the rest of a sequence of frames, a range of frames, if you want. So the consequence can immediately be perceived in contexts such as just having a text on top of a layer in the timeline is going to be instantaneous. There's no rendering that is involved to actually play that back. So for anything that's subtitles, but it's going to play perfectly, or logos, for example. The interesting thing also is that it actually affects a number of nodes inside of batch, which again are smart enough to figure out that they only need to render once and not anymore in the rest of the pipeline, because nothing is actually changing within those nodes. So that has a very big impact actually on just the overall user experience and how fast you can actually deal with certain relatively ubiquitous problems.
Does that actually remove the need for some of the MUX Node workarounds that people have been using to speed optimizations in batch?
Yes, there are indeed some instances where the MUX node is no longer required for that sort of optimization. It no longer needs you to freeze a frame for these nodes that are actually capable of being mindful of that absence of change. But there's still but the MUX node still is not retired. It's still something that you will want to use in some instances inside of the batch pipeline. But yes, it does indeed reduce the number of instances where it's actually required.
Another improvement in rendering in the current or the upcoming version, Flame 2015, is a new background reactor, background rendering possibilities. Mm-hmm. Can you touch on that? Because we've talked in the past in these interviews about the ability to leverage multiple GPUs within the system, where that might be used, and this seems like, well, it is the first implementation of that.
Yes, yes, it is definitely a first step in that direction, and I mean, as you point out, it actually it is really a service that will detect whether or not you have a second GPU inside of your system that is installed, and if it is obviously a supported configuration, it will actually offer you to have kind of like a localized background rendering task that actually uses that second GPU. and has very little overhead compared to regular burn. So it is still not something that I would say replaces burn, like network burn, entirely, since obviously, you know, it has the advantage of being local, but it has also that disadvantage since, you know, it is a GPU that is tied to your own system. And so if what's important for you is to actually share resources between multiple systems, that, you know, that's where burn is still extremely, network burn is still extremely useful. But if the intention is to have a local boost of performance or productivity, actually, I should say, with very little overhead, then I think that's definitely a very efficient solution. We've gone through the trouble of actually making a lot of optimizations for that service in the way that we transfer setups and things to that second GPU for background processing, and it is something that completely coexists and does not interfere with any I/O operations that would be happening in the background simultaneously. So yeah, it's a pretty, you know, it's a first step in using a second GPU in the system, but it is one that makes a lot of sense in terms of, you know, overall increasing of the productivity.
Yeah, from a user standpoint, it really does. I mean, I don't want to say it's identical, but it feels like burn in the way that you approach it. You're telling it to render effectively somewhere else, not in the foreground. So it seems, you know, when you get it installed, it works quite transparently. But is there some hope for improvements in the future? I mean, for instance, even how about faster foreground rendering, you know, twice as fast foreground rendering, or basically intelligently rendering stuff in the background as you're working on something in the foreground, so that when you hit play, everything renders.
Yeah, so yeah, for sure there is hope for that. It's definitely something that we've had on our radar since the beginning of this project. However, I think what you can, you know, a fair statement on my part would be to say that we will not release something that is not very compelling in terms of increase of performance. So this is something that we are definitely looking into is how we would best leverage and what has the most value for leveraging a second GPU, and there are a number of things actually that come to mind. And you know, turbo rendering, I guess, as we could call it, we're using, you know, teaming up two GPUs to accelerate foreground rendering is definitely one that would be interesting, providing that it performs a boost of performance that you would expect. But other things also could be on the radar, such as, you know, things like GPU debarring or stuff like that are non-trivial to perform in the current architecture. But those are things that are, you know, also on our radar.
Now, the graphics card support for that is fairly limited. What were the reasons behind that? Because I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it's limited to the 6000 series, whether it's the Kepler series or the regular 6000.
Yes, indeed, indeed it is, and it's primarily a question of configuration and fine-tuning, and also hardware support from the manufacturers. That's. There's a number of conditions that you know, we have to respect, and in some instances, you know, for example, it's the fact that we cannot install two K6000s on a Z800 is not something that you know, we are doing just to be I don't know, just to annoy customers. It's simply not supported by the manufacturers at this point. So so this is why the Z800 is actually restricted to a dual Q6000. The fact that we would insist on actually having also similar graphics board is to make sure also that there is, in this context, to make sure also that we can guarantee that we have absolutely identical results in terms of rendering between the two GPUs. And this is something, obviously, you can imagine that in the context of a timeline, this is not something that would be superfluous. It's something that's absolutely indispensable.
Well, speaking of performance, one of the things in this release of Flame is official support for 4K and Ultra HD. Now, we'll just assume that you can do that. But what I'm interested in is what that means. I mean, what technically did you need to do under the hood in order to support that in the way that you guys wanted to do so?
Well, it's actually well, quite a lot. It may not seem like much, but Yes, we had to do quite a lot of optimizations, both in the timeline, in the processing pipeline, in the display also. So what we wanted to make sure is that Flame was actually capable of being able to play back 4K, and I'm talking about real 4K at this point, not Ultra HD, up to 60p in real time, in a timeline. Also potentially sustain the ability to have at least one effect in real time, whether it's a color correction or something like that, a timeline effects. Those were the things that we wanted to make sure that we were capable of doing. And of course, if you reduce the frame rate and get back down to 24p or 30p, for example, it would open extra bandwidth to do things like real-time dissolves and things like that between two streams of 4K. But this is what we wanted to be able to do, is to have an environment where, first of all, you could monitor your 4K. So we would be supporting monitoring through a quad SDI, which is something that we weren't able to do. So so technically, even though you were able to actually do 4K inside of our systems, you weren't actually able to see it on a device that is capable of monitoring that resolution, and so that is something that is supported in the context of this particular release. And again, we feel we're confident that we can actually sustain now frame rates up to 60p, which is a pretty big performance departure compared to where we were in the previous release, for example.
Well, in order to get that image data also off the drive or off storage, really requires some beefy hardware as well from a storage standpoint. Frankly.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And so, it's. I mean, if you look at it, it's part of a. If you look at the things that we've been doing, whether it's the optimizations and even the single frame optimization, which has an impact for everybody, but of course it could become so detrimental to your experience on the software at higher resolutions that if you take a step back, it's a collection of different things that have been happening in the software concurrently to make sure that we manage to get that level of performance. And the background rendering also is something that actually is an addition to the system that makes a lot of sense, again, when you know that rendering times are just prone to get longer because you have 4 times the amount of pixels inside of your images. So you can look at it really as an entire package to deliver an experience that is Flame-like on 4K or Ultra HD projects. I should also mention the fact that we're completely capable of dealing with Rec 2020. It's a bit of an, right now Ultra HD and the devices out there are kind of like in a transitional phase where there's effectively a few that really support Rec 2020, but we're actually ready to support it whenever it's actually going to become a reality.
Well, actually, one aspect of performance in the software that I really like is Matchbox Shaders. Those are GLSL shaders created both by Autodesk as well as a great user community with the Logic Shader group. There have been some improvements to actually, I think, further enhance that, and I think will actually spur more development in Matchbox Shaders. Can you talk through some of those changes in this release?
Yeah, absolutely. And it was so exciting actually for us to see that that the community was finally embracing Matchbox, because Matchbox was introduced a while back. It was kind of one of those initiatives that we had to see, okay, let's test the waters and see what happens if you provide a tool that is more customizable and put it in the hands of Flame users, in the hands of the community. And it's actually quite a coincidence that like for the past 6 months, really, it's been picking up, and there's a buzz that's been developing within the community about what Matchbox can allow you to do. And it so happened that we actually decided, and concurrently, and again, it's a coincidence, it's a happy coincidence that we have, but that we wanted to actually add an extra layer of investment inside of Matchbox, and decided to improve a number of things. So things like the types of icons that you're capable of manipulating in the context of a Matchbox GUI, if you like. The fact also that we suspected that for some people it would be, they complained that they had no means to, for example, encrypt the shader, if they did, if they were willing to actually share the shader itself, but not necessarily the programming know-how or the recipe, which is something that you can understand. So this is something that we've added also in this new Matchbox instance. So it's possible to create encrypted shaders so that you can share your work, but not necessarily share the programming know-how if this is something that that is important to you. There's also, I guess, a number of as I said, like widgets that have been added. Also, types of buttons that we can now support that weren't previously supported. That overall make it for a much more, let's say, integrated experience. The types of tools that you can build, just because we handle things like pop-ups, for example, which we didn't necessarily do before. Things like that, I think, make for tools that can actually feel a lot more integrated. And sometimes it's just a question of detail, like the color of the connectors, the number of connectors that you want your tool to actually have inside of the batch schematic. So we no longer have a generic kind of look for the Matchbox. You can actually say it's a node that expects a front and a back and a mat, and actually have them appropriately colored based on the scheme that everyone expects. So, generally something that will allow users to create tools that feel a lot more integrated to our own tool set.
I think, speaking of integration though, having them in the timeline is crazy great from a performance standpoint.
Yes, and it's certainly not a random move as far as we're concerned. I mean, from the beginning, we wanted to deliver a means for people to develop something that relies, first of all, as an open language, is quite ubiquitous on the net or on the web, but also delivers kick-ass performance. And of course, the fact that we would bring this into the timeline is kind of like the next logical step. And not only that, but we also created a format that supports transitions also. So you can create any kind of funky transition at this point in the timeline that would actually use a GLSL fragment shader to do its work. So yeah, a lot more options there, and I think it highlights the fact that you can get really, really great performance directly within your story-centric environment inside of Flame right now, with your own tools.
Yeah, really, that's a really big change actually in the software, having them accessible in the timeline. Well, that's kind of an overview of the creative features. Before, can't let you go, of course, without talking about workflow changes, as we've talked about since the 20th anniversary edition release. Before we cross that, anything that I missed from a creative standpoint?
Yeah, I think I would mention something that could appear as a point of detail, but I think clearly is not, and I'll try to illustrate that with examples in more like the hands-on type of section. Yeah, we've made improvements to the IBL, something that we wanted to revisit for a while, and actually it provides much better controls now, and provides also an ambient mode, and IBL becomes really what we hoped it would have been in its first release, and we think that there are very creative ways of using IBL as an actual look development tool, and actually as a means to conform an entire scene to a specific color palette. So even though technically, we use, and this is so typical, I think, of what we do inside of Flame, where we kind of inherit technology or a concept that exists already in 3D applications, but we hijack to perform something that is quite different. So, and in this context, I think that if you look at 3D shape on one side, which is something that, again, is such an intriguing and interesting hybrid between a G-mask and a geometry, and IBL, and the fact that it is something that is capable also of affecting, and that we twist it around as a tool that allows you to affect the way that a geometry or a surface or anything that's in the scene actually adopts colors from an environment. You get something that is a very different approach to look development, I think, within the action environment. So I would love if people actually experimented with that and did not just, overlook the potential there of the conjunction of tools together.
Well, I think that's what action is all about, so I'm sure that'll happen.
Pretty much, yeah. You never know.
All right, so let's talk about workflow. It's been a rough couple releases, I have to say. I mean, I think everyone has seen the promise. People who have gotten used to the new workflow don't frankly want to go back to the old way of working, but there really are still things that people miss from the previous workflow in Flame. And some people, frankly, are still getting used to. So you've yet again made further refinements based upon user feedback with changes to the desktop, the workflow, and the library. I think one of the big, most visual changes, obviously, is you don't need a magnifying glass anymore in the media panel to view your proxies. But why don't you walk through some of the changes you made in your approach to the workflow in this release?
Yeah, I think I guess the difficulty is that it is a continuation that is both mindful of the feedback that we're getting from users, but is also, I think, faithful to the overall orientation and the vision that we have for the product. And in that vision, we want to have a very strong visual environment for creative tasks, and that's the desktop. That maybe we'll talk about that a bit later, because that also sees it's an important part of the workflow changes. As far as what you were referring to, first of all, there's an architectural change, yet another architectural change that makes its way into 2015 that allows us to be a lot more flexible about how you deal with libraries, and so we are able to bring back granularity that we had lost in the transition to the initial 20th anniversary release. That allows you, first of all, to save a reel as a reel inside of the library, or clips independently. All of that can actually be, or even batch snapshots, for that matter, are things that can now, appear inside of a library on their own. Shared libraries also become in many ways completely identical as far as functionality is concerned to actual libraries. So they are capable of storing pretty much anything that you want, whether it's a desktop, a reel, a clip, a batch snapshot, a BFX. All of those things actually are now, shared libraries are now on par with just regular libraries. And as far as organization also is concerned, this is also another thing that we wish we had been able to actually introduce much sooner, but I think pertains certainly to the feedback that you were alluding, like the unanimous feedback that we were getting from a lot of users, that it was just hard to keep track or recognizing media just with the smaller proxies. And so, as part of the architectural changes, we finally managed to pretty much merge all the browsing engines that we have in the application into one. And essentially, we have the same browsing engine that was first introduced in the Media Hub that is now also affecting the Workspace Media panel, finally delivering the ability to view your Workspace Media panel, if you want to, in the form of large scrubbable proxies that you can resize on the fly. It's a dynamic resize if you want, and we've also divided the media panel into tabs that are essentially shortcuts just to only visualize the library portion of your workspace or the desktop portion of your workspace. So those can all be accessed via hotkeys if you want to quickly toggle, and I think that completely changes the way that you will deal with media in the application in general. The fact that you have those large proxies everywhere where you have the Workspace Media panel essentially reduces drastically the number of times where you would want to switch back to the Reels view, for example, to pick something, because it essentially is there and you can scrub through it directly from the Workspace Media panel and then swipe back and hide it and continue to work inside of the batch view if this is what you were doing.
That selective filtering, I should point out too, between the desktop and the libraries also works hand in hand very nicely with return to dual view as well from an organizational standpoint.
Yes, absolutely. So what we have done with this is indeed, and you're right, this is something also that was very much requested almost unanimously, is the ability, first of all, to have a full screen view that would use large scrubbable proxies, but not only that, also bring back a means to actually split your screen into two areas of the same workspace for organizational purposes. And I think it ties also very well into the much more hybrid nature of the the Reels view, for example, that has kind of like a, an adjustable geometry where you can decide at any point in time how many reels you want to display to perform a specific task at hand. But the Workspace Media panel is always showing you the totality of all your reels, the totality of all your media, and it's just a hotkey away to switch to a full screen view that would have those large scrubbable proxies. So it makes the Workspace Media panel a much better organizational tool, both with the fact that each side of the dual view can also have its own settings. So you can have one side that is set to list view and the other side that's set to large scrubbable proxy views. Very flexible, very good for organizational purposes. And I think also overall affects the way that you just relate to media in the application in general, in whichever view you happen to be in.
All right, so that's the media panel, media hub. Changes have been happened, but actually some quite major changes in the desktop. And I think a big one for people to grasp is the desktop is not really what we think of as a desktop in the 2014 release, which is the grouping of reels. I think it encompasses much more in the Flame 2015 release, including your batch snapshots as well as your reels. It doesn't seem like a major change, but it is a major change, I think, from a user standpoint.
Yes, it is definitely something that actually, from our perspective, we see really as a continuation. When we first introduced the concept of views or tabs in the application, we clearly said that we saw the batch view. The reason for us promoting it at the very first level of the application, at the same level as the reels, at the same level as the timeline, is because we saw some very intricate collaborations between those three ways of showing media, very complementary. And so what we're essentially building, those were the building blocks of what we are now officially calling the desktop. So pretty much everything that you do, and that includes your current batch setup, is part of the desktop. So when you save your desktop, you save the totality of your creative work, whether it's the number of open sequences that you have in your timeline, the layout of your reels, the ones that are, again, the ones that are hidden, not hidden, your current batch setup. And when you snapshot a setup, you're actually iterating, but you're iterating within the desktop. So I think if there's anything that people have to understand, like the bottom line for users to understand is, if you save your desktop, you're good, okay? Remember that. Save your desktop. Even if the only thing that you're doing is just starting from scratch in batch, save your desktop, because you know what? Batch is part of the desktop now. Now, for people who may freak out on this, and I just want to point out, yeah, I'm sure there will be, because it is something definitely that you kind of need to get adjusted to. But I mean, we haven't necessarily removed the ability to save text setups as you did before, so that's still there. But really, at this point, I think the bottom line for people to remember is that creative space in which you bring things to do stuff at a specific moment is what we now call the desktop, and it far extends beyond the reels. It also includes everything that is in your batch schematic and your batch view, and when you save that, it is saved as part of your desktop. So that is a departure from what people knew before, but again, it is indicative also of where we're taking this environment, this creative environment.
But it does, and I think saw in speaking with some of the customers who are working on beta, it does actually cause you to look at things differently because it is much more encompassing. I mean, do you have any tips, and maybe at least when you're starting out with this new approach, how to approach using the new desktop, which is not just the reels, but is also the batch and your batch snapshots?
Yes, I think the other thing that we are, that has to be understood is that we think that the desktop is an environment that that we are designing to scale as your project or your view over that project is actually evolving over time. So, the fact that when the 20th anniversary was introduced, we intentionally decided to have desktops that could have more reels than what you can actually display on screen was also already indicative of the fact that we were in the process of building something, a creative environment, which kind of scales or has the capacity to scale with your project. And so we don't necessarily mean for people to necessarily adopt it, but this is how we are designing it. And this is actually something that will become more and more apparent as the software evolves over the next couple of releases. I think if there's anything, if there's anything that, again, people have to remember is that you have to save your desktop more than ever. If you don't, you will probably lose work without realizing it. Okay, even though we warn you, we will warn you, don't do this. If you do this, if you haven't saved it, you may lose it. Okay, but if you save your desktop, that's essentially, I think you'll be on the safe side of things. Side by side, and as I've started in this conversation, we've also brought back a lot more granularity in the way that you can essentially save any kind of component that belongs to a desktop, typically whether it's reels, independent clips, or batch snapshots. If you want to slice and dice that structure and tailor it within the libraries to whatever way you want to approach a project, we actually let you do that. So under cursor save is back, and it is as granular as it was prior to the introduction of anniversary release. But our intention and the design behind the desktop is to create something that is capable of growing, is a lot more encompassing, and the one thing that you have to remember is that if you save it, everything is saved with it.
Again, it takes a bit of getting used to, another slight adjustment in your workflow, or maybe major depending upon how you use the software, because I know people use it in such a variety of ways. But again, you're starting to see more finesse, more refinement, and frankly, as you pointed out when we first started talking about it, addressing many of the concerns that users have had since the 20th anniversary edition was released. Well, again, congratulations on another solid release. Nice to see a big release at NAB. I guess the next time we chat, it'll be IBC. Thanks for taking the time to talk to us.
Sure. Thank you, John.
I'd like to say I think it's a good release. They're starting to get that workflow back to the way artists like, with the library views and so forth. I love the creative tools. For instance, I love the 3D shape tool on Replica. But one thing I also want to mention that we didn't mention is Flame Premium owners are another group of owners that are going to be really happy, because now as part of Flame Premium, they not only get Luster, but they get a copy of Flare as well as Flame Assist, which is the OS 10, I guess, Flame Assistant workstation, which right now is Smoke on Mac with a Flame-like skin, but moving forward will diverge from Smoke on Mac and is something that's truly an assistant workstation that makes sense to run alongside Flame. So I guess that's it for our Flame coverage, and that's it for this FX Guide TV.
Right. As I mentioned earlier, check out the RC podcast for news about the production world. Jason Wingrove and Mike Seymour. And speaking of Mike Seymour, we have to mention Mike's not with us at this NAB. He did decide not to come this year, so we miss him greatly. And
I rode in the back seat by myself with the front seat open in the car, just as a tribute to Mike
missing
not being
man
here.
Formation.
Yes, missing man formation. It was a bit odd for Jeff, I think. But
yeah, well.
Anyway, that's it for us here at NAB. Let's head on back to Angie in Sydney.
Thanks, John. And I just have enough time to say that if you want to follow us on Twitter, and you're not, then we are at FX Guide News. Or on Facebook, just go to facebook.com/FXGuide, where we post not only FX Guide, but also FX PhD news and updates. So until next time, see ya. For more industry news, in-depth features, podcasts and forums, check out fxguide.com. And for visual effects training, check out fxphd.com.